I always believed that marriage was about mutual support, understanding, and loyalty. Never in my life did I think that one ordinary dinner conversation could shatter all of that. My name is Thaddeus. I'm not someone who stands out in a crowd. I've always been a quiet, dependable guy. I believed in love that could withstand anything, and I thought I'd found it with my wife, Clarice. We've been married for 13 years, and for the most part, I thought we were doing okay. Sure, we had our ups and downs. Who doesn't? But I thought our bond was solid, built to last. Until a few weeks ago. It was a Tuesday evening. Nothing special. We were sitting at the dining table, eating spaghetti I'd cooked after getting home from work. Clarice had her phone out, scrolling mindlessly as I tried to make small talk. She wasn't really engaging, but I didn't think much of it. That was just how she was sometimes. Busy, distracted, tired from her day. Then she said it. "Thaddeus, I've been thinking," she began, not looking up from her phone. Her voice was casual, almost detached, like she was commenting on the weather. "About what?" I asked, hoping for some meaningful conversation. "Closeness in a marriage. It's optional, don't you think?" I stopped mid-bite, the fork freezing in my hand. "What do you mean, optional?" She sighed, still not meeting my eyes. "I just mean, people grow, they change. We don't have to be tied to each other so tightly. Space is important. Independence is healthy." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and confusing. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, but I tried to stay calm. "Are you saying we're too close? That you want distance?" She finally looked at me, her expression unreadable. "I'm just saying that not every relationship needs to be so consuming. We can still care about each other without being so involved all the time." I didn't know how to respond. My heart was pounding, but my mind was blank. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the latest diet trend or a TV show recommendation. "I didn't realize you felt that way," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's just a thought," she replied with a shrug, already turning her attention back to her phone. "Don't overthink it, Thad. You always make everything a bigger deal than it needs to be." But it was a big deal. It felt like a crack had just formed in the foundation of our marriage, and I was the only one who noticed. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. She went to bed early, leaving me alone at the table with a pile of dishes and a head full of questions. Was this just a passing thought, or was there something deeper behind her words? The next few days did little to ease my concerns. Clarice started acting differently, coming home later, giving vague excuses about work or errands. Her phone, once left casually on the counter, was now glued to her hand. She'd tilt the screen away from me when she got a notification, her fingers moving quickly as she typed. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was off. But every time I tried to bring it up, she brushed me off with a sigh and an eye roll. "Thad, you're overthinking again," she said one evening when I asked why she was so secretive with her phone. "You're being paranoid." That word stung. Paranoid. Was I? I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe that I was just imagining things, that my fears were unfounded. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed, and it wasn't just in her words. It was in the way she looked at me, or didn't. For the first time in 13 years, I felt like I didn't really know my wife at all, and that terrified me. After that night, the tension between Clarice and me only grew. I tried to shake off the nagging feeling that something was wrong, but every little thing she did seemed to confirm my fears. She'd leave early for work and come home later than usual. When I'd ask her what kept her so busy, she'd give vague answers like, "Oh, meetings ran late," or "I needed to catch up on some things." She had never been this distant before. It wasn't just her schedule, it was her attitude. She used to laugh at my dumb jokes, or at least pretend to. Now, it was like I didn't exist half the time. She wasn't outright mean, but her indifference cut deeper than any harsh words could have. I told myself it was just a rough patch. Every marriage has them, right? Maybe she was stressed from work. Maybe she needed time to herself. But then there were the signs I couldn't ignore. Her phone, for example. It was always with her now, like an extension of her hand. She'd take it with her into the bathroom, something she never used to do. I started to notice how often she smiled at her screen, a small, private smile that I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. I finally worked up the nerve to ask her about it one evening. "You've been on your phone a lot lately," I said as casually as I could manage. "Anything interesting?" She barely looked up from the screen. "Just work stuff," she said, her tone flat. "Work stuff makes you smile like that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, but failing miserably. She glanced at me, her smile fading. "Why do you always have to make everything a big deal, Thaddeus? It's just emails and messages. Don't read into it." That response might have satisfied me a year ago, but now it felt like a lie. I didn't press her, though. What was I supposed to do? Demand to see her phone? I didn't want to be that guy, the controlling, jealous husband. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and it was growing fast. A week later, the turning point came. I had taken the afternoon off work to catch up on some errands and decided to surprise Clarice with dinner. I picked up her favorite takeout from a little Italian place we used to frequent when we first started dating. I thought maybe a nice evening together would help us reconnect, or at least open the door to a conversation about what was going on. When I got home, her car wasn't in the driveway. That wasn't unusual, considering her recent late nights, but something about it still felt off. I walked into the house, setting the food on the kitchen counter, and noticed something strange. Her work laptop, which she always took with her, was sitting on the dining table. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe I just reached my breaking point. Either way, I sat down and opened the laptop. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I needed answers. At first, everything seemed normal. Her work emails were open, and there were several spreadsheets on the desktop. But then I noticed a minimized browser window at the bottom of the screen. I clicked on it, and my heart dropped. It was a string of messages in a chat app one didn't recognize. The messages weren't work-related. They were personal, very personal. "I can't wait to see you again," one of them read. "Last night was amazing. I've missed this so much." The name at the top of the chat was unfamiliar, just a generic username. But the tone of the messages was unmistakable. This wasn't a colleague or a friend. This was something else. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. My stomach churned, my hands shook, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I scrolled through the messages, each one cutting deeper than the last. "I wish I could spend the whole weekend with you." "Don't worry, he's clueless. He won't figure it out." "You make me feel alive again." I slammed the laptop shut, my mind racing. Was this real? Was my wife, the woman I'd trusted with everything, actually having an affair? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at nothing. When I finally pulled myself together, I decided I couldn't confront her just yet. I needed to know the full story before I did anything. That night, Clarice came home around 9 p.m., her hair freshly styled and her makeup looking perfect, far too perfect for someone who claimed to have spent the evening at work. She barely glanced at me as she walked past, her phone buzzing in her hand. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to sound normal. "Busy," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed early." She kissed me on the cheek, the gesture so robotic it felt like an insult, and disappeared upstairs. I sat alone in the living room, my mind spinning. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something was happening, and it was tearing us apart. But how do you confront the person you love when you're afraid of what they'll say? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sound of Clarice's breathing next to me. How could she sleep so peacefully while I felt like my world was falling apart? Every fiber of my being wanted to wake her up and demand answers, but I knew I wasn't ready. I needed proof, something concrete to confront her with. The next morning, she left early, as usual. She didn't even say goodbye, just grabbed her bag, phone in hand, and walked out the door without a second glance. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee, replaying the messages I'd read on her laptop in my head. I knew I had to act. Sitting around and pretending everything was fine was no longer an option. I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. The call felt surreal. I found the investigator, a guy named Carlton, through an online recommendation. His voice was calm, professional, and straightforward. "You're not alone in this," he said when I explained my situation. "We'll get to the bottom of it. Just be prepared. The truth isn't always easy to hear. I gave him all the details I could, her schedule, her habits, even the messages I'd seen. He assured me he'd start immediately. The next few days were agonizing. Clarice continued her usual routine of late nights and vague excuses, while I played the role of the clueless husband. Every time she walked out the door, my heart sank a little more. I'd find myself staring at my phone, waiting for an update from Carlton, hoping for answers but dreading them at the same time. Then, on a Thursday evening, the call came. "Thaddeus, I've got something," Carlton said. His tone was serious, almost apologetic, and it made my stomach drop. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's meeting someone," he said. "A man. They've been seeing each other regularly, restaurants, a park, and once at a hotel." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Hearing it confirmed out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Do you have proof?" "Yes," he said. "I have photos and videos. I can send them to you, or we can meet in person." I opted to meet in person. I didn't want to see those images on my phone, in the same space where I'd once exchanged sweet text with Clarice. The next day, I met Carlton in a small cafe on the edge of town. He handed me a folder, and my hands shook as I opened it. The first photo was enough to break me. There she was, my wife, sitting across from a man I didn't recognize. They were at a small, intimate restaurant. She was smiling, that smile, the one I hadn't seen directed at me in months. Her hand was on his, their fingers intertwined. I flipped through the photos, each one more damning than the last. There were pictures of them walking through a park, his arm around her waist, their heads close as they talked. And then there were the ones I dreaded most, photos of them entering a hotel together, their faces full of excitement and anticipation. "Is there any doubt about what's going on?" Carlton asked, his voice soft. "No," I said, my throat dry. "There's no doubt." I went home that night feeling like a stranger in my own life. The images replayed in my mind over and over, taunting me. When Clarice came home, she was cheerful, more cheerful than she'd been in weeks. "I grabbed some takeout," she said, setting a bag on the counter. "Figured we could eat together." The sheer audacity of her acting like nothing was wrong made my blood boil. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but I held back. Not yet. We ate dinner in near silence, her chatting about her day while I nodded along, barely listening. I couldn't bring myself to look at her, knowing where she'd been and who she'd been with. That night, as she slept beside me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her continue this charade, but I wasn't going to confront her without a plan. If she wanted to make our marriage optional, as she'd so casually put it, then I would too. But first, I needed to figure out what that meant for me. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I alternated between heartbreak and anger, between wanting to fight for our marriage and wanting to walk away completely. I started seeing everything in a new light. The little things I'd overlooked, the times she dismissed me or made me feel small. I began to wonder, had I been blind all along? Had I ignored the warning signs because I didn't want to see them? But the most painful question of all was the one I couldn't shake. Why wasn't I enough for her? The answer, I realized, didn't matter. She had made her choices, and now I had to make mine. I wasn't going to let her destroy me, no matter how much it hurt. But first, I needed to confront her. And this time, I wasn't holding back. The following evening, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder Carlton had given me. My hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. I was done second-guessing myself. I'd spent enough sleepless nights wrestling with doubt and heartbreak. It was time for answers. Clarice walked in around 8:30 p.m., her usual cheerful, almost smug demeanor in full force. She set her purse on the counter and gave me a quick, dismissive smile. "You're up late," she said, her voice casual, as if everything were perfectly normal. I gestured to the chair across from me. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, just slightly, but she sat down. "What's going on?" I slid the folder across the table toward her. "Take a look." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the edge of the folder. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, but then she opened it. The first photo was all it took. Her face went pale, and she closed the folder quickly, her hands trembling. Where did you get this? She asked, her voice sharp and defensive. I think the better question is, why did I need to get it? I replied, my tone calm but firm. You've been lying to me, Clarice. For weeks, maybe months. I trusted you, and you threw it all away. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. Don't insult me by denying it. I know everything. She sat there, silent, her expression shifting from fear to anger. You had no right to invade my privacy, she finally said, her voice venomous. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Privacy? You think this is about privacy? You're the one who destroyed our marriage, and now you're trying to make me the villain. Her eyes narrowed. You're being dramatic, Thaddeus. Relationships aren't black and white. Maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have had to. Stop, I said, cutting her off. Don't you dare try to blame this on me. I've done everything I could to make you happy, and this is how you repay me. She crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. What do you want me to say, Thad? That I'm sorry? Fine, I'm sorry. But honestly, maybe this is for the best. Maybe we've been holding each other back. I stared at her, stunned by her audacity. Holding each other back? Clarice, I've been nothing but supportive of you. I've given you everything I have, and you've been sneaking around behind my back. She rolled her eyes, and that was the final straw. The sheer lack of remorse was like a slap in the face. You know what? I said, standing up. You're right. Maybe this is for the best. Because I deserve better than this. Better than you. For the first time, she looked genuinely caught off guard. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said, grabbing the folder and shoving it into my bag, that I'm done. If closeness is optional, then so is this marriage. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting there in stunned silence. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of control. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least now, I was ready to face it. After leaving the kitchen that night, I sat in my car in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my thoughts. The confrontation had been explosive, but it felt incomplete. I wasn't sure where to go from here. Part of me wanted to drive away and never come back, but another part of me wanted to make her understand the pain she'd caused. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying every word she'd said. Maybe we've been holding each other back. Her words echoed in my mind, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Was this how she really saw our marriage? As some sort of anchor dragging her down? The next morning, Clarice came downstairs, looking far too composed for someone who had just been caught cheating. She glanced at me on the couch, her expression a mix of annoyance and indifference. Are you going to sulk all day? Or can we talk like adults? Her tone lit a fire in me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Talk? You want to talk now? I asked, sitting up. Because last night, you didn't seem too interested in explaining yourself. She sighed dramatically, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. Look, Thad, I've been thinking. Maybe we should take a break. Give each other some space. A break? I repeated, incredulous. You mean so you can continue sneaking around without feeling guilty about it? Her eyes flashed with anger. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We both know things haven't been great between us for a while. Maybe this is a chance for us to figure out what we really want. I stood up, the frustration boiling over. You mean what you want. Don't pretend this is some mutual decision. You've been making choices behind my back for months, and now you want to spin this as a fresh start? She crossed her arms and glared at me. Fine. You want the truth? I haven't been happy for a long time. You're predictable, Thaddeus. Safe. And honestly, that's not enough for me anymore. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent years building a life with her, thinking I was giving her everything she needed, only to find out I was just convenient. I see, I said quietly, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay composed. Well, if that's how you feel, then let's make it official. No breaks, no space, just a clean break. Divorce. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise with a scoff. Fine, if that's what you want. It's not what I want, I said, my voice rising. But clearly, it's what you've been working toward, so let's stop pretending. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, feeling both furious and heartbroken. That day, I called a lawyer. If Clarice wanted out of this marriage, I wasn't going to make it easy for her. I wasn't going to let her walk away with everything while I was left picking up the pieces of my life. A few days later, she moved into the guest room. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was short and tense. She acted like she was the victim in all of this, like I was the one tearing our life apart. It was infuriating, but I refused to let her manipulate me. One evening, as I was going through some paperwork for the divorce, she came into the room. "So, what's your plan, Thad?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "My plan?" I replied without looking up. "Yeah, you've made it pretty clear that this is over. So what now? Are you just going to sit here and wallow in self-pity?" I set the papers down and looked at her. "No, Clarice. I'm going to rebuild my life. Without you." She rolled her eyes, but there was something behind her bravado, something that looked an awful lot like regret. "Good luck with that," she said before walking away. As the door closed behind her, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. It wasn't the kind of freedom I had wanted, but it was freedom nonetheless. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let her drag me down anymore. The days of putting her needs above my own were over. It was time to put myself first. And so, the fallout began. The silence in the house was deafening after Clarice moved into the guest room. Every time I walked past her closed door, I felt a strange mix of anger and sadness. It was surreal. Just weeks ago, I thought we had a solid, if imperfect, life together. Now, I was living with someone I barely recognized, someone who seemed to revel in tearing apart everything we'd built. But I wasn't about to let her destroy me. If she wanted distance, she'd get it. I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I started with small steps, things I could control. The first was meeting with my lawyer, who laid out the process for the divorce. "Thaddeus," she said, looking at me with sympathy, "I've handled a lot of cases like this, and I can tell you one thing. Don't let her walk all over you. Protect what's yours." Her words stuck with me. Clarice had been dismissive, even cruel, during our recent interactions, but I knew she'd fight for her share of everything when it came to the divorce. She always had a way of twisting situations to her advantage, and I couldn't afford to underestimate her. That weekend, I decided to get out of the house. Sitting alone with my thoughts was driving me crazy. I went to a local park, one I used to visit often before life got so complicated. The air was crisp, the kind of early autumn chill that feels like a fresh start. I sat on a bench, watching families play and couples walk hand in hand. I couldn't help but wonder, where had we gone wrong? Was there a moment I could point to, a decision I'd made or a conversation we'd had that set us on this path? Or had it been inevitable, a slow unraveling that I had been too blind to see? As I sat there, lost in thought, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Thaddeus, this is Carlton. I thought you should know. I found more." My heart sank. I had asked Carlton to keep digging, to make sure there was nothing I'd missed. I wasn't sure if it was a good idea anymore. Did I really want to know? We met later that evening. Carlton handed me another folder, his expression grim. "I'm sorry, Thaddeus. This isn't easy to see, but I thought you'd want the full picture." Inside the folder were more photos, but this time, they weren't just of Clarice and the man from the restaurant. There was a second man, a different one, meeting her at a coffee shop, walking with her in the park, even sitting in what appeared to be the same hotel lobby as before. What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "She's seeing more than one person," Carlton said gently. "I'm not sure how long this has been going on, but it's not just one affair." I couldn't breathe. One betrayal was bad enough, but this? It felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Who was this woman I'd been married to for 13 years? Had I ever really known her? Carlton placed a hand on my shoulder. "Take your time with this, Thaddeus. You don't have to decide anything right now." But I knew, in that moment, that there was no coming back from this. Whatever shred of hope I'd been holding on to was gone. When I got home, the house felt colder than ever. Clarice was in the living room, scrolling on her phone. She glanced up when I walked in. "Where've you been?" she asked, her tone casual, as if she had any right to question me. "Out," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. She raised an eyebrow. "You're being weird lately, you know that?" I didn't respond. Instead, I walked past her and went upstairs to my office. I closed the door and sat down at my desk, staring at the photos Carlton had given me. It was time to stop being passive, time to stop letting her control the narrative. If she wanted to play games, she was about to find out I wasn't the pushover she thought I was. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of clarity. I didn't know what my next move would be, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done being her safety net. If she thought she could have her optional closeness while keeping me as her fallback, she was in for a rude awakening. This wasn't just about divorce anymore. This was about reclaiming my life. And I wasn't going to stop until I did. The anger had settled deep inside me now, no longer a burst of rage, but a steady burn. I had spent too long being a doormat, too long making excuses for Clarice's behavior. That ended now. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. "I want to move forward aggressively," I said. "She's not just cheating. She's playing multiple men at the same time. I want to make sure she doesn't walk away with anything she doesn't deserve." My lawyer didn't hesitate. "Then we need to act fast. Start separating finances, document everything, and prepare for an ugly fight." That suited me just fine. That evening, I came home early. Clarice was in the kitchen, sipping a glass of wine, looking relaxed, too relaxed for someone whose world was about to come crashing down. "You're home early," she said, raising an eyebrow. I smirked. "Yeah, thought we should talk." She sighed, already annoyed. "Again? Thaddeus, we've been over this." "Oh, I don't think we've really been over it," I said, taking a seat across from her. I pulled out my phone, swiped through a few files, and set it down in front of her. Her face paled. "What's this?" "Go ahead," I said. "Look." She hesitated but picked up the phone. I watched as her expression shifted, confusion, then shock, then barely contained panic. The photos of her with both of her affair partners flashed on the screen. One at the restaurant, one at the hotel, another man in a coffee shop. More texts, more proof. She knew she couldn't talk her way out of this. When she finally looked up at me, there was something new in her eyes. Fear. "How did you?" I cut her off. "Doesn't matter. What matters is that I know everything. And I've already spoken to a lawyer." She swallowed hard. "Thaddeus, No," I said sharply, standing up. "I don't want to hear it. You've lied, manipulated, and disrespected me for months, probably longer. And I let you. That was my mistake. But now? Now, I'm correcting it." She stared at me, her lips slightly parted. For the first time in our entire marriage, I saw it. She had never expected me to fight back. She had expected me to stay quiet, to roll over and let her get away with it. But that wasn't happening. "You need to start making plans," I said, walking toward the door. "Because soon, this house won't be yours anymore." And then I left her sitting there, her face drained of color, her glass of wine untouched. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The final act was still to come. The silence in the house was suffocating after that night. Clarice barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short and tense. I could tell she was scrambling, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. But for once, she couldn't. I had the upper hand now, and she knew it. I wasted no time moving forward. My lawyer worked quickly, and within days, the divorce papers were ready. I made sure they protected me. Clarice wasn't getting a dime more than she deserved. No cushy settlement, no parting gifts. If she wanted freedom, she could have it. That night, I walked into the living room where she was sitting, scrolling on her phone like she had no care in the world. I placed the divorce papers on the coffee table. "It's done," I said. "Sign them." She looked at the papers, then at me, her jaw tightening. "You're really doing this?" I laughed coldly. "Are you seriously asking me that? After everything?" She exhaled sharply, grabbing the papers and flipping through them. "You're punishing me," she muttered. "You just want to hurt me." I shook my head. "No, Clarice. You did that to yourself. I'm just making sure you don't get to hurt me anymore." She stared at me for a long time. I wondered what was going through her head. Maybe she was finally realizing what she'd lost. Maybe she thought she could manipulate her way out of this. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. After a moment, she grabbed a pen and signed the papers. Just like that, 13 years of marriage ended with a few strokes of ink. She set the pen down and looked up at me. "Is this really what you want?" I met her gaze, my voice steady. "I want my life back." She nodded slowly, something almost resembling regret flashing in her eyes. But it was too late for that. A few weeks later, she moved out. Watching her pack up her things was surreal. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just packed in silence. Maybe she thought she'd find happiness with one of the men she'd been seeing. Maybe she thought she'd be better off. As she walked out the door, she turned to me one last time. "You'll regret this," she said. I smiled. "No, Clarice, you will." And with that, she was gone. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I felt the weight of everything crash down on me. But each day, it got a little better. I focused on myself, on the things I had neglected while I was trying to hold together a marriage that was already broken. And eventually, I realized something. She had been right about one thing. Closeness was optional. But respect, loyalty, love, those weren't. Clarice had made her choices. And now, I was finally free to make mine. And I chose me.